91. What the Greek Septuagint scriptures can teach us. When making a translation of the Old Testament scriptures, there are generally two primary sources, those being the Masoretic Hebrew text and the Greek Septuagint text. What would shock most people is the Hebrew texts are only about 1,000 years old, at least the ones that have survived, whilst the Greek manuscripts and even the Latin Vulgate translations of the Old Testament are far older than the Hebrew Masoretic by several centuries. This creates a strange predicament. Which of these are more reliable, the manuscripts written in Hebrew or the far older ones in Greek? Furthermore, have there been any deliberate corruptions of these texts or the translations to alter our Bible? But first we should explain how we ended up with ancient manuscripts in different languages. Originally, Moses, the prophets, and the scribes wrote their prophecies and texts in Hebrew. However, with the Assyrian deportations, the Israelite kingdom was broken, and then about a century later with the Babylonian deportations, the Israelites who returned to Judea to rebuild were continuously subject to the various world empires coming and going. This meant that other languages would have a great influence on them. Therefore, we should note that we do see an Aramaic or Syrian language influence in some of the later texts of the Old Testament, such as the book of Daniel, who was in Babylon when writing his prophecies. Aramaic was the lingua franca of the Babylonian Empire and remained so even during the Persian Empire. However, later, by the time of Alexander the Great, the lingua franca changed to Greek, or at the very least throughout Judea. This fact is enormously downplayed by modern so-called historians, as a European language dominating the East by the time of Christ does not fit their agenda. They instead insist that Christ and the apostles spoke Aramaic. After Alexander died, his great Eastern Empire was cut up and divided amongst his generals. Ptolemy came to rule over Egypt, and his son Ptolemy II requested that the laws of the Judeans be translated into Greek, as he was interested in them. His request was granted, and as the story goes, 72 Israelites from Judea came and translated the scriptures into Greek. Although strangely, this translation became known as the Septuagint, which means translation of the 70 and not 72. These translations were made around the 3rd century BC, which by our times makes them quite ancient. It's important to understand these were real Israelites, our ancestors, translating their own scriptures to Greek, not random foreigners having a go at copying the Bible, so these translations are genuine. So over the centuries, as more and more copies were made, these manuscripts spread out through Europe, and by our time there are thousands upon thousands of manuscripts. The manuscripts were gathered together to form codices and complete Bibles. However, some codices were based on previous codices. Since there is always the chance of codices picking up mistakes, intentionally or unintentionally, for the purpose of forming the most accurate translation of the Old Testament into English, logically one would want to seek out the oldest possible codices and even individual manuscripts if possible. As for the Masoretic Hebrew text, with Christ's ministry, many of the real Judeans lost their identity and became Christians, being absorbed amongst the rest of the Israelites in Europe. And as for the race of Cain, they never accepted Christianity, and then with Jerusalem being destroyed, they began to also be dispersed. However, they maintained their false identity. Surprisingly, they also maintained copies of the Old Testament, but in Hebrew. As the centuries went on, only they could still speak Hebrew, and this immediately would set them up as gatekeepers and perceived authorities on the Hebrew language and even the Old Testament scriptures, at least for the Masoretic version. All Hebrew manuscripts were gathered together so that only one Hebrew canon would remain, which they would have control over. However, since there were masses of Greek Septuagint manuscripts and codices of the Old Testament throughout Europe, they couldn't just start changing the Old Testament scriptures, as they would be caught out immediately, but they could make minor, sneaky adjustments, shall we say, which most Christians are oblivious to. You really need to carefully compare the Masoretic and Septuagint two together, and also understand that the Europeans are the Israelites. What is certainly interesting, by seeing the minor tweaks they made to the Masoretic Old Testament scriptures, you can see what they were trying to distort and cover up. That being that we are the people of the Bible, they've always tried to stop us coming to that truth. So let's go through the little minor differences. So first you must realize the Phoenicians were Israelites. The Israelites dominated all the coastland in the kingdom of Israel. It was they who built up vast fleets, harbors, and trade traversing the entire Mediterranean, setting up up colonies and even new nations, even reaching as far as the British Isles. And there are many verses which make this clear, and especially link the great seaport Tyre both to the Phoenicians, the Europeans, and them both being the Israelites. Therefore, most of the distortions in the Masoretic focus on creating a barrier between Tyre and other port cities being Israelite dominated. They are trying to push that these were all Canaanite harbours. So in a nutshell, the numerous European colonies and nations that sprung from the Israelite Phoenicians were in fact Canaanites. That is the lie they are trying to create. Firstly, in Joshua 19, where it is explained which tribe got which territory and the accompanying cities, in the Septuagint we get a clear, concise account of Naphtali receiving the city Tyre, where we read, "And the walled cities of the Tyrians, Tyre and Omodakaf and Kinnereth." Whilst a few verses earlier in Asher's inheritance, it is explained that Asher's territory would border on Tyre. Both the Masoretic and the Septuagint agree on this. However, when we go back to the Naphtali's inheritance, this time in the Masoretic, there is no mention of Tyre, where we read, "And the fenced cities are Ziddim, Zer, and Hamath, Rakath, and Chinnereth." So they have changed the verse to not include Tyre. With that change, it is left ambiguous. Was Tyre controlled by the Israelites or not? These subtle changes would be used to push the idea of a separate Canaanite Phoenicia controlling the coast. But it will now go further, as they will try to hide Israelites even being in the Mediterranean as well. But firstly, some scriptures to absolutely show Tyre belonged to Israel. After the conquest of Canaan, and once the Israelites strengthened in their possession of the land of Canaan, as the biblical records suggest, Josephus explains that Solomon had forced all the remaining Canaanites into slavery and made sure Israelites ruled over them to keep them in check. So how could a separate Canaanite city exist, let alone an entire coastline? Furthermore, even before Solomon's time, when David had his census of Israel, Tyre and Sidon were among the places where it was conducted, and here both of these cities are distinguished separate from the cities of the Hivites and of the Canaanites, so they must have become Israelite cities, which Christ also attests in Matthew, where he is scolding cities, comparing them to Tyre and Sidon for not repenting, and he says even Tyre and Sidon would have repented, which is something only Israelites can do. Therefore, they must have been Israelite cities. Now if we move on to Ezekiel, in his lamentation of Tyre, he is scolding Tyre for turning against their brother, the Israelites, which again shows that Tyre must have been an Israelite city. So firstly, a verse that shows Israelites were in Cyprus. Surprisingly, the King James translated this one correctly. So Ezekiel 27:6, "Of the oaks of Bashan have they made thine oars, the company of the Asherites have made thy benches of ivory, brought out of the isles of Chittim." Now Chittim was one of the sons of Javan, and it is referring to Cyprus. Here we see that the tribe of Asher was in Cyprus, an island of famous Phoenician colonies, which was subject to Tyre before the Assyrian conquest, which Josephus attests to. If Israelites controlled the islands in the Mediterranean, are we supposed to believe they didn't control the ports on their own coastland? So here in the Masoretic, and we'll use the English Revised which followed it, they removed Asher from that verse, instead having boxwood. And if we check the word Strong's 839, they are trying to argue that Asher is not the tribe of Asher, but referring to a box of wood. Then a few verses later, the Septuagint adds a line to Ezekiel 27:18, and this time the King James Version messed up, so we'll read Brenton's Septuagint. "The people of Damascus were thy merchants, by reason of the abundance of all thy power, wine out of Chelbam, and wool from Miletus, and they brought wine into thy market." In the King James, which followed the Masoretic here, they removed any reference to Miletus. Miletus was an ancient Carian Phoenician settlement in southwest Anatolia, so they're trying to hide a connection to Tyre, probably because the people in Anatolia at this point were white, so one might deduce that the Phoenicians and Tyrians were white. Then in the next verse, the Septuagint, which surprisingly the King James got right this time, makes it clear that the tribe of Dan, the Danaan Greeks, and Javan, the Jabephite Ionian Greeks, brought trade to Tyre, and this is the Danaans who went straight to Greece during the Exodus, such as Achilles, Agamemnon, Odysseus, etc. If not, how can Israelites trade with Dan, one of their own tribes from a seaport, unless this Dan referred to is far off, a colony in Greece, as they are linked with with Javan, the Ionian Greeks, so the Danans must have been in Greece. Once again, the Greeks were white, so if you realize they are the tribe of Dan, you're going to put 2 and 2 together. But guess what? The Masoretic removed Dan in this verse and changed it to the Dan, which is Strong's 2051, which they claim is a place of unknown origin, and if you scroll down, they claim possibly somewhere in Arabia. So as always, they're trying to hide that many of the Greeks were Israelites. But that's not all. Now turn into Amos and Micah. Concerning the prophecies which forecast the destruction of Israel and the Assyrian deportations, we find 2 mentions of Tyre in the Septuagint. In other words, Tyre is part of the Israelite kingdom, but these are wanting in the King James Version and the Masoretic. So firstly, Amos 3:11, where the King James Version states, "An adversary there shall be even round about the land," but the Septuagint has a less ambiguous, "O Tyre, thy land shall be made desolate round about thee." The rest of the verse agrees with the Septuagint as countries, where the King James Version has palaces. Speaking to the children of Israel in Micah 7:12, in the Septuagint it reads, "And thy cities shall be levelled and parted among the Assyrians, and thy strong cities shall be parted from Tyre to the river, and from sea to sea, and from mountain to mountain." Of course, the Masoretic doesn't include Tyre there. So once again, they're trying to separate Tyre, the mother city of the Phoenicians, from the Israelites. Now we shall add a little bit from Josephus as well. The tribe of Naphtali was evidently not alone in Tyre. There is a workman whom Hiram had sent to assist Solomon in the building of the temple, and this both the Masoretic and Septuagint are agreed, where we read in 1 Kings chapter 7, "And King Solomon sent and fetched Hiram out of Tyre. He was a widow's son of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in brass, and he was filled with wisdom and understanding and cunning to work all works in brass, and he came to King Solomon and wrought all his work." However, Flavius Josephus, whose copies of scripture seems to have been much more complete in many respects, wrote of this in Antiquities book 8, "Now Solomon sent for a craftsman out of Tyre, whose name was Hiram. He was by birth of the tribe of Naphtali, on the mother's side, for she was of that tribe, but his father was of of the family of the Israelites." So Josephus did not know the father's tribe, but here we see he accounted Tyrians as Israelites. So how did Europeans throughout history view the Septuagint? Educated men who wished to create translations, such as Martin Luther. Well, the people had control over the Masoretic text, launched campaign after campaign over the many centuries, criticizing the Septuagint, leveling all sorts of accusations against it. Therefore it fell into total disuse by the Western churches. So most popular translations, therefore, including the King James Version, the English Standard Version, the New American Standard Version, and the New International Version, relied heavily on the Masoretic text as the basis for their translations, virtually ignoring the Septuagint. Therefore, a lot of the minor tweaks they made to the Masoretic text came through to our English and European Bible translations. Although more recent translations have put much greater weight on the Septuagint, the damage to Christianity has already been done. But those minor mistranslations are not the only damage, as the Masoretic text also removes several books completely from the Old Testament. As we showed last proof, the books known as Maccabees, 2 Ezras, Susanna, Wisdom of Solomon, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes should all be included in our Bibles. All of these books give us extra vital information. As we explain, they show how Judea had become mixed by the time of Christ, that the Israelites went north to Asareth in Europe, that the Canaanites were impersonating the tribe of Judah even during Daniel's time, and finally from Solomon that Yahweh had married the children of Israel exclusively, who are his wife, and the events in the Garden of Eden in Genesis are explaining a fallen angel seducing Eve, resulting in the birth of Cain. But since the Masoretic texts were seen as the authority and did not include those books were removed to a separate Apocrypha section, so even Martin Luther fell for this and their insidious influence. Finally, there is one more drastic error. That is the timeline from Adam to now. In Hebrew Masoretic, they have blatantly tampered with the patriarchs' lifespans and birth timelines. For example, in the Septuagint, Adam does not father Seth until he is 230, and Seth does not father his son Enosh until he is 205. Yet in the Masoretic, they have removed the 100 years, so Adam seems to father Seth at just 130, and Seth fathers Enosh at 105, so they're removing 100 years from all the begetting ages of every early patriarch. This is significant because in the Hebrew Masoretic, the flood was 1,656 years after Adam, but in the Septuagint, it's 2,262 years after Adam. That's a whole 600 years difference, and this corruption continues after the flood up to Abraham. The Masoretic reduced the begetting age of all the patriarchs from Shem to Abraham, so in the Masoretic it seems as if Noah is still alive when Abraham is born, that Shem outlived Abraham, that Shem was alive even when Jacob was born. But in the Septuagint timeline, Noah has been long dead for almost 1,000 years by the time Abraham comes along. Additionally, the lifespans in the Septuagint of the patriarchs seem much more natural as they gradually are living shorter lifespans, whilst in the Masoretic it is far more drastic. Early Christians accused them of doing this to make it seem the coming of Christ was out of sync with the timeline of all the prophecies in the Bible. In other words, Christ couldn't be the Messiah as he came at the wrong time. This failed as Europe still accepted Christianity and we became Christendom. So whilst the timeline change does not necessarily change anything for realizing who we Europeans are or who the people of the Bible are, or altering any doctrines or beliefs in Christianity, it has been abused and Christians are accused of believing the world is only 4,000 years old or roundabout. Now first we must point out that the Bible never tells us how old the world is, only how long ago Adam was created. With the correct Septuagint timeline, that would be roughly 7,500 years ago, which is far older than the corrupted Masoretic timeline. The Adamic creation began at that time, but that does not mean that there were fallen angels messing around with creation long beforehand, that there were Nephilim in pre-existing time, perhaps even thousands of years before Yahweh created Adam. And this is how there is already a tree of knowledge of good and evil in existence when Adam is created. Overall, in conclusion, with all these minor adjustments to the Masoretic, making it seem Tyre was not an Israelite city, which was the mother city of the Phoenicians, and additionally with the books such as Solomon being removed, if we were to look at this like a detective searching for motives and patterns, we could deduce that there was a clear sinister plot behind all of this, with the objective to hide the identity of the Europeans being the Israelites, as well as to protect the identity of the race of Cain. Imagine during the Protestant Reformations 500 years ago, if our people had instead followed the Septuagint, or at least held it in higher esteem with all their translations, perhaps things would be very different today. Finally, taking it further, we can also see the connection between trying to corrupt the Bible and now much later with them ruling the world, how they have taken it far further, introducing false histories and science such as evolution and all that nonsense, that we don't come from Adam but instead evolved from monkeys, that we Europeans don't originate from the Far East from Noah and his sons, but instead originate in Europe as cavemen living through ice ages for tens of thousands of years, and all other made up BS history. They couldn't get away with it back then, so they settled and succeeded greatly in corrupting Christianity. Now they don't need to do that anymore. One day though, our people will finally wake up and see through the lies and realize who we truly are, the people of the Bible. 92. What the Dead Sea Scrolls scriptures can teach us. In the 1940s and 50s, an amazing discovery was made, generally called the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were roughly 25,000 fragments of text, which included many new fresh sets of ancient Hebrew scriptures. They date back to anywhere from 50 BC to the time of Christ. Therefore, they are incredibly ancient and far older than the Hebrew Masoretic scriptures, which are only roughly 1,000 years old. However, many of the texts found were mere fragments and quite small, although a few large scrolls were well preserved, including the copies of Isaiah and Psalms. Copies of Deuteronomy are also well represented. Some people have claimed that the Dead Sea Scrolls shook the foundations of Western religion, but this is a lie, usually to sell some book. None Nonetheless, the Dead Sea Scrolls are important and useful to us for numerous reasons. Firstly, they give us a third witness apart from the Hebrew Masoretic and the Greek Septuagint scriptures. They contain various apocrypha books such as the Book of Enoch, some parts which have never been seen before. They have some scrolls in Greek, which shows that this sect at least were more than happy to use the Greek language. They use the name Yahweh even on the Greek scrolls, where typically it would normally be substituted with Kyrios, which means Lord. They contain copies of parts of all Old Testament books except Nehemiah and Esther. Esther should certainly not be in our Bibles. Before we elaborate, we should give a little history to the background to the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in a number of caves near the West Bank, about 13 miles south of Jerusalem. The Rockefeller family funded a museum on the West Bank to house and study the scrolls. Archaeologists and other scholars, many from the United States, Britain, and other Western nations from all across the world, studied them there up until 1967. However, this did not last long, as in the Six-Day War the West Bank was seized. All access to the Dead Sea Scrolls was shut off until after 1992. During this period, only select academics were allowed access. So for 25 years, most scholars were totally shut out of access to the Dead Sea Scrolls. By the late 1950s, most of the fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls had been transcribed, but they were not yet published. John Strugnall, a professor at the Harvard Divinity School, was the chief editor of the Dead Sea Scrolls publication project. He was also intimately acquainted with the scrolls before both 1967 and after 1992. Once Strugnall complained of missing scrolls and nefarious deals between certain academics and antiquity dealers. Among other things, various accusations were made against him. He was slandered as being a depressed drunkard, and there was a successful campaign to have him removed from his position. This all sounds like typical treachery, and for these and various other reasons, I would suspect that we certainly do not have all the information which the Dead Sea Scrolls may have contained. Strugnall reportedly complained of several missing scrolls, including a copy of the Temple Scroll and a whole complete copy of Enoch. Only a few fragments of Enoch were released to the public, but Strugnall insists there was originally a complete copy and they deliberately hid it. Were they afraid what Enoch may reveal to us? As for the Dead Sea Scrolls providing a third witness to the ancient scriptures, previously the primary sources for the scripture were either the Hebrew Masoretic text or the Greek Septuagint. Since there were some differences between these two, having a third source available would help mediate the differences and act as a third witness. In other words, if there are two verses that are slightly different in the Masoretic and the Septuagint, how would we know which one was correct? Now we can look to see how the verses in the Dead Sea Scrolls to give us some greater accuracy when translating the scriptures to English or any European language. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain fragments of apocrypha books such as Jubilees, Tobit, 1 Enoch, which includes the separate books of Noah, Book of Giants, where even Gilgamesh is mentioned, and other works, the astronomical writings attributed to Enoch, and the Testament of the Patriarchs, along with many apocryphal works. However, the existence of these works in the scrolls is not necessarily by itself a sign of their canonicity. Rather, we must realize that these scrolls are part of the library of just one sect in Judea, and that sect is not necessarily any better than the other sects, which we know had their own problems and disputes over the legitimacy of various religious writings. Nevertheless, the Book of Enoch is quoted by the apostles, and the fragments found give us further insight into what the fallen angels were doing and how we ended up with the Nephilim races, which allegorically in Genesis as a whole are described as the tree of knowledge of good and evil. What is also interesting is some fragments of some of the biblical books are written in Greek, so it shows that the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls certainly weren't Hebrew purists and didn't mind using the Greek language. Most modern Bible academics stubbornly insist the apostles did not speak Greek. Here we see that the Dead Sea Scrolls writers certainly did. Additionally, at least several of the Greek texts have the tetragrammaton, Yahweh, rather than the Greek word Kyrios, which means Lord, wherever it appears in the manuscripts. When the Greek Septuagint was translated in Alexandria, Egypt, about the year 300 BC, the translators changed all references of Yahweh to the Greek word Kyrios, which means Lord. Jerome's translation into Latin, commonly called called the Vulgate took the Old Testament from the Septuagint, so it did not use the name of God but substituted the Latin word Dominus, meaning Lord. But here the Dead Sea Scrolls sect in their Greek scrolls maintained the name Yahweh, and on the Greek text they changed Kyrios back to Yahweh. We really should be using the name of our God, Yahweh. By Christ's time, where Herod and the other descendants of Jacob's brother had usurped power in Judea, they had banned the use of the word Yahweh. Josephus, in his writings, which would be a little later than the time of Christ, explains that he is no longer allowed to use the name. Evidently, there was a time when he was allowed to use it. Christ explained to the apostles that the Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses, therefore they had to obey the laws so long as it did not strictly break the laws Yahweh gave to us. However, around 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed and their authority ended once and for all. Therefore, there is certainly no ban on the name Yahweh, and we Christians should be using it again. Here we see that the Dead Sea Scroll writers were still using it, potentially even defying the Pharisees in doing so. But that's not all in relation to Greek. The Dead Sea Scrolls generally followed the Greek Septuagint more closely than the Hebrew Masoretic, but not always. This adds much further weight to the veracity of the Greek Septuagint and certainly diminishes the Hebrew Masoretic as the ultimate authority on the Bible scriptures. However, unfortunately, many critical passages disputed on our Bibles are not represented. That does not mean that they did not exist, but only that these parts of the scrolls disintegrated with time. For instance, Genesis 3:15, where Eve is seduced by the serpent, is not in the Dead Sea Scrolls, all the way through to Genesis 4:1 on the birth of Cain and who his father is, and the beginning of Genesis chapter 6, where the fallen angels begin taking Adamic wives. All of these passages are missing. It is possible that they deliberately removed them. Some people have tried to say that the Dead Sea Scrolls were hidden for 25 years to protect Christianity, as it would change Christianity forever. Now, when the scrolls were discovered in 1947 and they were collected and deposited in a museum in the West Bank, for 20 years they were studied by Western scholars and photographs were made of all the scrolls and fragments. So in 1967, when the war broke out and access to the Dead Sea Scrolls was restricted, by that time books had been released on the photographs, although it is claimed a book of Enoch went missing and wasn't photographed. Regardless, it is hardly conceivable that access to the scrolls would be blocked in order to protect Christianity. One of the books released was the Scrolls from the Dead Sea Scrolls by Edmund Wilson in 1955. If anything, access would be restricted only to protect the identity of the race of Cain and make sure that nothing was found which would expose the truth that the Europeans are the people of the Bible. While there are indeed some gems in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are not truly any important contributions to our understanding of Christianity which lend value to what we already have in our own Bible. The real value is in the apocryphal literature, such as that fragments of Enoch, which we can then use in accordance with what we already have in the Bible as an additional witness to its antiquity. And also, having that third witness helps when translating the Bible. That is the primary value of the Dead Sea Scrolls and what we can learn. 93. Israelite culture and Greek culture were the same. The Israelites spread out and colonized Europe from the time of the Exodus, as we've explained in many proofs. It should be no surprise then that these colonies, which grew to become great nations in their own right, exhibited many close religious beliefs and customs to the Bible. These similarities cannot be explained if the cultures were not related. If there, for example, we examine the Greek customs, we will find similarities that only serve to prove the Israelites had settled Greece. And since the Greeks were white, and we can determine many of which were Israelites, then so were the rest of the Israelites, and ultimately we can determine the Europeans are the people of the Bible. Beginning with the Greek belief in gods, we should first give a quick run through of the biblical narrative. So in the Bible we learn that fallen angels, which are also allegorically called the serpent, had mixed creation and therefore fell from the grace of Yahweh, and some of the Apocrypha suggest that the fallen angels are bound in a dark pit somewhere awaiting judgment. So importantly, the fallen angels and all of their creation are always seen as evil, with no room for repentance and doomed to a destiny in the lake of fire when Christ returns. But then there are also the false alternative myths being spread by evil races such such as the Canaanites. Here the creation story is twisted to spin their origin in a positive light. So in one variation, all races were created from a great serpent out of chaos, the serpent Tiamat. The serpent is seen as a force of good, and there is no difference between all races. Furthermore, Yahweh is removed from the picture altogether. In another version, gods came down from the sky, mating with mankind, creating demi-like gods and other mixed creations such as centaurs. Here the fallen angels are elevated to gods, and their offspring are not seen in a negative light, rather they are seen as heroes and great beings like Gilgamesh. Again, Yahweh is not present in this twisted story. These present propaganda by the race of Cain and Nephilim to justify and explain their existence, to even give themselves a divine-like origin. And as we compared the Greek beliefs on the gods, unfortunately some of these myths had weaseled their way in. In Greek mythology, a pantheon of gods existed. However, the leader was a head god, Zeus. The story goes that Zeus and the other gods had fought against another set of gods which are called Titans. Zeus and his side had prevailed and bound the Titans up in a prison, and this is very similar to the biblical narrative, although rather than one supreme god, Yahweh, locking up fallen angels who aren't gods, instead it's simply a battle of lesser gods, with the good side winning and the evil side being bound up in prison. But since the Israelite Greeks were separated from the main body of Israelites in Palestine, we should not be surprised that their beliefs would deteriorate and fall away from the core truths. Additionally, the Greeks believed the gods were mating with humans, creating demi-like gods such as Hercules was believed to be part god and part man. So where did they get this myth from, as this is exactly what the fallen angels were doing, as we read in Genesis 6 and other verses. The Greeks also believed that the gods had created hybrid monsters called chimeras, such as eagles merged with lions, as well as centaurs, horse with men, and many others. Again, this is all incredibly similar to the biblical account of the fallen angels corrupting creation. In some of the Greek myths, Apollo had cast out a great serpent from the heavens called Python. This serpent was now earthbound, and if you put the pieces together and understand in the Bible, the serpent is an allegory for the fallen angels, which later in scripture their offspring, particularly the race of Cain, take over the role as this earthbound serpent. Then you see where they get this myth from. Here it should be noted that the Greeks did not try to make the serpent into a good character. It was seen as an evil entity, unlike the Canaanites and other wicked races. The Greeks also held the belief that their god Zeus, who held the scepter of sovereignty over men, would be replaced by his own son. So in Ecclesiastes, Prometheus bound from line 755, "What shall Zeus one day be hurled from his own dominion? Thou wouldst rejoice, I trow, to see that happen. How should I not, since 'tis at the hand of Zeus I will suffer ill? Then thou mayest assure thyself that these things are so. By whom shall he be despoiled of the scepter of his sovereignty? By himself and his own empty-headed purposes. In what wise, O tell me, if there be no harm in telling, he shall make a marriage that shall one day cause him ruth, with one divine of birth, or with a mortal? If it may be told, speak out. Why ask with whom? Of this I may not speak. Is it by this concert that he shall be dethroned? Aye, since she shall bear a son mightier than his sire." So in the second psalm we have a prophecy of Yahweh God anointing his own son to be ruler over the nations, where we read, "Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree, that Yahweh hath said unto me, Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Be wise now therefore, O ye kings, be instructed, ye judges of the earth. Serve Yahweh with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and ye perish from the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all they that put their trust in him." Originally, the ancient Greeks believed in the resurrection from the dead as well, that when a man died that they would abode in Hades, although there was no way out of Hades, the prison, unless a god intervened, such as in the play written by Euripides entitled Alcestis. The wife sacrifices herself to save her husband, and Hercules descends to Hades to save her because of her bravery. This is congruent with the Hebrew Sheol. For example, when Jacob believes that his son Joseph has died and says he will mourn for him, he remarks, "For I will go down into the grave unto my son mourning." But the word translated to grave is actually Sheol. Jacob believed he would join Joseph one day in the underworld. The primary difference in these beliefs is the Israelites understood predicted that one day Yahweh would save us all as the Messiah Christ, which they all look forward to. Christ himself used the word Hades several times, such as in Revelation, where he promised to destroy Hades and death. Therefore, when an Adamite dies, we now go to Christ rather than the underworld, and we will no longer die upon his second coming. The Greeks also had a limited understanding of different races similar to the Genesis 10 account. For example, the relationship between Dorians and Persians from Ecclesiastes. The Persians line 176, where the poet puts these words into the mouth of Atossa, the mother of Xerxes, the Persian king, as he goes off to invade Greece in war. I have ever been haunted by many a dream at night since my son, having fitted forth his armament, departed hence with intent to lay waste the land of the Ionians. But never yet I held so distinct a vision as yesternight. I will describe it unto thee. I dreamed that two women in fair vesture, one apparelled in Persian garb, the other in Dorian attire, appeared before my eyes, both in stature far more striking than the woman of our time, in beauty flawless, sisters of the self-same race. So Ecclesiastes was a veteran warrior of the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, and he wrote only a few years after the wars with the Persians. He did not consider the Ionians to be related to the Persians, but here in the mouth of his character he professed that the Dorian Israelites and the Persians were sister races. If you only understand that the Ionians were from Japheth, and the Israelite Dorians, as well as the Persians, were Shemites, therefore they were more closely related than the Japhethites. The Greeks also shared a capital punishment, the punishment of stoning, and this is found in Ecclesiastes 7 against Thebes from line 196. There the poet puts these words into the mouth of Eoclesus, the king of Thebes: Now if there be one who shall refuse obedient to my authority, man or woman, or whosoever it betwixt, sentence of death shall be passed upon him, and he shall in no wise escape destruction by stoning at the people's hands. So stoning was a method of capital punishment among the Thebans, according to the poet. Thebes was a Phoenician colony, yet stoning is again mentioned as a punishment used amongst the Argives at Agamemnon at line 1616, where it portrays the people as having said to Aegisthus: I tell thee, in the hour of justice, thou thyself, be sure of that, shalt not escape the people's curses, and death by stoning at their hands. The Argives were Danaan Greeks, so Israelites as well. The Greeks also believed in the blood of the innocent, which cries out for vengeance. So from Ecclesiastes, the libation bearers, from about line 36 we read: Heavens were under pledge, declared that those beneath the earth complain in bitter anger and are wroth against their slayers. For what redemption is there for blood once fallen upon the earth? To that we shall compare Genesis chapter 4. And Yahweh said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not, am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. Then again from Revelation chapter 6, And when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God, and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge, and avenge our blood unto them that dwell on the earth? The struggle between sons and bastards is also described in Euripides' Hippolytus, lines 962, where we read, The bastard is always an enemy to the true born. To this we must compare to Hebrews 12. But if ye be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then are you bastards and not sons. We may also compare Galatians 4. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the spirit, even so it is now. Of course there is the murder of Cain and Abel, and the persecution of Christ by Cain's descendants. Also the kinsman avenger of blood, again from the libation bearers, line 269. Of a surety the mighty oracle of Loxias will not abandon me, charging me to brave the perils to the end, and with loud utterance proclaiming afflictions chilling my warm heart's blood. If I avenge not my father on the guilty, biding me infuriated by the loss of my possessions, slay them in requital even as they slay. And of the other assaults of the avenging spirits he spoke, destined to be brought to pass from a father's blood, for the darkling bolt of the infernal powers who are stirred by slain victims of kindred race, calling for vengeance. Now this is a precise parallel to that same Hebrew next of kin blood avenger that we see described in Numbers chapter 35 and elsewhere. When a man is slain, his next of kin are obliged to see that his slayer is brought to justice. As for the mourning of the dead, the wearing of black and the cutting of hair is also similar to the Israelites. There are many examples in Greek writings, but one example, Euripides' Alcestis from line 425, in the mouth of Adamatus, king of Feria in Thessaly, I command all the Thessalonians in my realm to join in the mourning for my wife. Let them cut their hair and wear black apparel. Sackcloth was worn by Hebrews in mourning the dead, and that too was black, which is evident in Revelation 6. And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. The cleansing of sin with either blood or baptism, this is found in Ecclesiastes Eumenides at line 448. It is the law that he who is defiled by shedding blood shall be debarred of all speech until the blood of a suckling victim shall have besprinkled him by the ministrations of one empowered to purify from murder. Long since at other houses have I been thus purified both by victims and flowing streams. So here we see that the Greeks believed that one may be cleansed of the sin of murder either by baptism, flowing streams, or by the blood of the sacrifice. To this we may compare Hebrews 9, for if the blood of bulls and of goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean sanctify to the purifying of the flesh. So in the Bible, one empowered to purify from murder would be a Levitical priest, and more specifically the high priest. So we see that the Greeks also thought that such a task could be accomplished only by certain individuals. But of course the cleansing of sins with baptism is found only in the New Testament in the baptism of John, where in the Old Testament the sins of the children of Israel could only be cleansed with the blood of sacrifice. Dancing in honor for a god is found in Euripides' Bacchaea from line 206. Bacchaea is a play about the feast of Bacchus, another name for Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and revelry. The poet puts these words into the mouth of the character Tiresias. Will someone say that in preparing to dance with my head crowned with ivy, I show no respect for my old age? No, for the god has not distinguished old from young where dancing is concerned. He wants to receive joint honor from everyone and to be magnified by all without exception. So in the Exodus, the Israelites rebelled, worshipping and dancing around the golden calf. However, later in scripture, dancing was certainly accepted in honor of Yahweh. For example, in the 149th Psalm, praise ye Yahweh, sing unto Yahweh a new song and his praise in the congregation of saints. Let Israel rejoice in him that made him. Let the children of Zion be joyful in their king. Let them praise his name in the dance. Let them sing praises unto them with the timbrel and the harp. For Yahweh taketh pleasure in his people. He will beautify the meek with salvation. So the pagan gods were honored by dancing in both the Greek literature and in scripture, and Yahweh God was also honored by dancing. Laws emanate from God. The Greeks believed that laws emanate from God or gods. The gods were seen as lawgivers and punishers of the disobedient, just as the Hebrews received their law from God and were punished for being disobedient. For example, in Euripides' Ion around line 440, the poet puts the following words into the mouth of the title character. I must rebuke Apollo. What is wrong with him? Ravishing unwedded girls and abandoning them, begetting children and then sitting idly while they die. Do not act this way, since you have power, pursue goodness. Any mortal who is base is punished by the gods. So how is it right that you who prescribe laws for mortals should yourself be guilty of lawlessness? But there are also parallels here to Genesis chapter 6, as there are throughout all the Greek myths. The sins which the Greeks had thought were committed by gods, the prophets of Israel had assigned to the fallen angels, creating the Nephilim. Then we have purification, the time of purification following childbirth, from Euripides' Electra line 654, where she asked an old man to announce the birth of her son to Clytemnestra, the widow and murderer of Agamemnon. Electra was also a daughter of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, and like her brother Orestes, she had also felt compelled to avenge her father's murder against her mother. So after she tells him to go and announce the birth of her grandson, hoping to lure her mother, the old man asked how long it has been since the birth, and she responds, 10 days ago, the time a woman who has given birth keeps pure. To this we must only compare Leviticus chapter 12, and Yahweh spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, If a woman has conceived seed and born a man-child, then she shall be unclean 7 days, according to the days of the separation, for her infirmity shall be unclean. And in the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised, and she shall then continue in the blood of her purifying 30 days. She shall touch no hallowed thing, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying be fulfilled. But if she bear a maid child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks, as is her separation, and she shall continue in the blood of her purifying 66 days. So the Greeks only shortened the time, but clearly upheld held the same tradition. Overall, we see a cultural tie between the Greeks and Israelites which cannot be explained unless you realize they were the same people. With this, you can begin to realize the Israelites settled Europe, not just Greece, but all of Europe. They became the Europeans and are the people of the Bible still today. 94. The New Testament was written in Greek. One common deception is the claim that the apostles and Christ spoke in Aramaic, and the New Testament was also written in Aramaic, but this is a lie. The New Testament was written in Greek, specifically for the Greek-speaking Greco-Roman world, as Luke attested in his Gospel that Caesar taxed the world, so the Roman Empire was Luke's world. Additionally, Yahweh had prophesied that he would speak again to the deported Israelites, for with stammering lips and another tongue will he speak to his people. This process began initially in Greek, as his Gospel was spread to his people in the Greek New Testament, and eventually becoming Latin throughout the Catholic Church period, and now English has become the dominant language of his people, the Europeans. As we've explained in previous proofs, most popular Bible translations are in English. Yahweh spoke to us in a new tongue in European languages for Europeans, and since all the prophets make it clear the Gospel was prophesied to be for the lost tribes, we can only conclude the Europeans are the Israelites who received the Gospel in their own language and nobody else. As for Aramaic, Christ and the apostles frequently mentioned speaking in their native tongue, and they always called it Hebrew and not Aramaic. However, Greek was the lingua franca of the Roman Empire, whilst at this time Latin was primarily only used within the Roman Senate and military. Since Judea was a province within the Roman Empire and had been largely Hellenized since the time of Alexander the Great's conquest over 300 years prior, the common language spoken therefore in the region was Greek. Why should we be surprised at all if the Judeans also spoke Greek, and the apostles wrote the New Testament in Greek? Why would they write the Gospel in any other language? With this in mind, we should wonder, why is there such a push to try and make out that Aramaic was the language the apostles used? Would it truly make a difference? So if the apostles spoke Greek and Hebrew, but specifically wrote all their writings in Greek, it becomes clear who they were intending their Gospels for. The lie that the Gospel was written in Aramaic is part of a bigger sinister deception, since the Antichrist tried to push the narrative that the Middle East always had populations and demographics looking the way they do now. They create a false concept that Christianity was a Middle Eastern Aramaic speaking religion, which was absolutely unrelated to us Europeans. And from here, building upon that lie, a whole pack of other lies are stacked on top. For example, that Christianity was an alien religion brought into Europe, that Europeans are the silly Gentiles and not the people of the Bible, that Christianity was a Trojan horse to weaken Europe, ripe for takeover. And the list goes on, and we shall cover those deceptions in a later proof. The oldest known manuscripts of any portion of the New Testament in Aramaic dates to the 5th century, and several known translations into Aramaic from Greek were created even later, such as the Philoxeniana in the early 6th century or the Harklensius in the early 7th. There was a Syriac harmony of the Gospels called the Diatessaron, made in the late 2nd century by Tatian, which has not survived, but that was an attempt to rewrite the 4 Gospel accounts into one single harmony and should not be reckoned as actual scripture. Regardless, the oldest manuscripts we have are all in Greek. Furthermore, if one is well versed in Greek, from reading the manuscripts it becomes clear that they are not a translation. For example, Mark several times explains Israelite customs in his Gospel as though writing to a Greek audience. The only book of the New Testament which may have any claim to have been originally written in Hebrew is the Gospel of Matthew, as the 2nd century Christian writers Papias of Hierapolis has left an ambiguous statement that Matthew collected the oracles in the Hebrew language. Then the later 2nd century Christian writer Irenaeus had also attested in his Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 1, that Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect. However, even if Matthew had written a gospel account in Hebrew, it has not survived, and the Gospel of Matthew we have today was originally written in Greek. It is not a translation. Rather, the copies of Aramaic New Testament scriptures known to scholars today are all translations from earlier Greek versions. Even Paul's epistle to the Hebrews was originally written in Greek. But that's not all. There is another proof which only someone well versed in Greek could spot. The apostles were using the Greek Septuagint scriptures as their source for at least many Old Testament citations. In other words, they were reading Greek and must have been able to speak Greek, speaking an approximate approximate terms, there are nearly 300 citations of passages from the Old Testament found in the scriptures of the New Testament. Of these, almost a third are verbatim or nearly verbatim citations from the Septuagint, and close to another third are somewhat modified, often merely for context, where it is still evident that the Septuagint text was the source. Of the balance, some are paraphrased, whilst others favour the Masoretic text, or on occasion the Aramaic Targums. This pattern is not consistent among the authors of the New Testament scriptures. For example, the citations from Matthew and the Revelation seem to favour the Septuagint less frequently than those of either Luke or Paul. So the fact that the New Testament was written in Greek and that Greek translations of the Old Testament were made in anticipation for the fulfillment of those words found in Isaiah chapter 8, that with stammering lips and another tongue will he speak to his people, helped to prove that Christ never intended to come merely for Judeans, but rather he came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, for the 12 tribes scattered abroad, who had mostly all come to know Greek to one degree or another by the time of his coming. If Yahweh God knew beforehand which language he had in mind when the words of Isaiah were recorded, Greek must have been that language, and of course he knew because he is God. Christ and the apostles came for the Europeans, and we are the people of the Bible. 95 similarities of words in Hebrew and European languages. There are many similarities in the European languages and Hebrew. This is because when the Israelites migrated to Europe, they brought their mother language with them, but historically languages have never stayed static or the same. Languages evolve over time, and so did Hebrew. It became the many diverse European languages that exist today. For this reason, there are many fundamental words in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and English, which are so very similar as they share a common origin. Since many English words are derived from Greek and Latin, there are trails, so to speak, all the way from Hebrew via Greek and or Latin to English, which show our ancestry. It should as always be no surprise then that Antichrist spread deceptions in an attempt to hide this. In order to separate and distance Hebrew and European languages, entire false histories and timelines are invented to create an impression they are completely unrelated. Generally speaking, European languages are classified as Indo-European, whilst Hebrew is classified as an Afro-Semitic language. But the truth is, Hebrew is Indo-European, or at least the mother tongue of all the Indo-European languages. So technically speaking, since the Europeans are the Israelites, and therefore descend from Shem, all of our languages should be classified as Shemitic. But we should go deeper and explain the origin of the Israelite language. Abraham and his fathers, who are ostensibly the first recorded speakers of biblical Hebrew in the historic narrative of scripture, had come from Haran. Haran in Pandanaram, or the plain of Aram, north of the Euphrates River, which was the homeland of his fathers. This was slightly further north than Carchemish, the capital city of the so-called Indo-European Hittite Empire, so modern academics have no qualms to consider a branch of the Canaanites as Indo-European, but the Hebrews, who are closer to Europeans, they refuse to connect. Now the Egyptians, being Mizraim, descendants of Ham, and in recent centuries Hamitic languages, including the Cushite language of Ethiopia and the Berber language, were considered together to be an African language group, but not any Semitic language. Furthermore, whilst Arabic has its roots in Aramaic, which is a Semitic language from Aram, Arabic seems to have developed within the first few centuries of the Christian period as a local form or dialect of Aramaic, which has been the lingua franca of the Babylonian and Persian empires. Arabic as a language only became popular on account of the Quran and expanded into Africa along with the expansion of Islam from the 7th century. So here we have a list of hundreds of words which must have originated from Hebrew into Latin, Greek, and English. Since the list would take hours to go through, we shall just pick our 10 favorites. The first is the Hebrew word avir, which means the air. In Doric Greek, aber, which was actually pronounced identical to the Hebrew avir, meant air. Then we have the Greek word ether, which means the brighter, purer air, the sky, whilst avir meant the lower air. Then in Latin, air was the atmosphere. And finally in English, we still have the word air, but also ether and atmosphere, and many others which likely stemmed from the word air. Then we have the Hebrew word ish, which means a man or a male. Now in English we have man, a different word. However, when you say a man who is from England, you don't say England man, you say English, or that he is English. So the Hebrew word ish is there for man at the end, added on to the end of England. This shows our Hebrew ancestry. Why else would we use ish, which means man, for English? On to the Hebrew word ara, which means earth or land. In Greek you have aurora, which means arable land, but also arrow, which means to plow. And in Latin there is ara, which means to plow, but also aratio, meaning cultivation or arable land. Latin also has arator, meaning farmer. In English we have which means land suitable for growing crops, and we also have the word area. We and our Israelite ancestors and were an agrarian society. We would naturally link the word land to suitable farming land. Here we should also point out that many of our words would have come from either Greek or Latin, which came from the Hebrew. Next we have the Hebrew word dam, which means blood. In Latin, damer meant to condemn, and in English, of course, we have to be damned or to damn someone. In the Bible, your bloodline certainly can damn you. Cain and all his descendants were damned because of his bloodline being descendant from a fallen angel and Eve. So we can see how the word gradually evolved to the modern meaning of damn or damned. Now an easy one, the Hebrew word, which is also a letter in the Hebrew alphabet, hey, which means hello. Even today in English, thousands of years later, we still say hey or hi to greet each other. Next, the Hebrew word kela, which means prison. In Latin it became kel with a C, which means chamber, and in English we use that for cell, which is a small room in which a prisoner is locked up. However, interestingly, as biology has advanced, cell also came to be used for the smallest structure and functional unit of an organism, which is funny because we are trapped in our bodies and our ancestry. As Christ said, to get into heaven you must be born from above. If you're not, you can't change who you are. In some ways our bodies are prisons, and the Apostle Jude described the Nephilim as trapped in chains of darkness, meaning their bodies. They cannot escape the fate that awaits them, the lake of fire. This one is interesting, the Hebrew word mehar, which meant to bargain for a wife. However, in Latin, maritar meant your wife, and maritar meant to marry. In English, we have mare, which is a female horse, and we also have marry and marriage. Originally, marrying a woman was only consummated when you slept with her and she became your wife. If you did not, then you were not husband and wife. As in Genesis explains, a man will leave his parents and cleave to a woman, and they will become one. Additionally, it was always custom, in order to get a wife, you would bargain with the father to get his daughter. Now our society has been corrupted by the Antichrist. We went to calling on women, to dating, now to casual meeting, and no strings attached swinging, and all kinds of perversions. Next we have muaf, moth, or maveth, which means to die and death. So in Latin it became mors, meaning death, mortus, meaning dead, mortalis, meaning mortal, morbidus, meaning sickly, and morbus, meaning sickness. From those in English we of course have mortal, but also morgue, mortuary, morbid, and possibly murder. However, we also have mortgage. In Old French, gage meant pledge, so mort and gage meant death pledge. Originally in European culture, specifically amongst our Germanic tribes, we never devised or allowed mortgages, and all forms of usury were banned under Christianity. But the Antichrist gradually infiltrated our nations, set up banks, and introduced these financial laws into our nations to plunder us. Mortgages really are evil. On to mekir, or makashabeth, or makashabeth. This meant a stroke, i.e. a battering ram, or a contrivance, i.e. a texture, machine, or intention. In Greek, mechane was an instrument, machine, mechanima, was an engine, and mechaninome was to construct or build. In Latin, machina, large mechanism, machinera, to engineer, and in English we ended up with make, a machine, mechanic, machinist. Our ancestors and related Europeans didn't have a sophisticated technology, yet they were always inventing and creating new technology. We still have the word machine, although our idea of a machine now is probably far more complex. Okay, the last two, nephal, nephel, or nephel, which means to fall or something fallen. In Greek, they somehow got an S before the word. It's spalio, to make to fall, cause to fall, and spal magma, to trip, stumble or fall or failure. Whilst in English we lost the first NA part, a PH would often be pronounced as an F, so to fall, to fail. The angels that rebelled and began mixing creation fell or nefel from the grace of Yahweh, and the Nephilim or fallen ones are all around us today, flooding our nations. Finally, para or para with an H. It means to bear fruit. In Latin, parere meaning to bear, bring forth, give birth to, and pirum means pear. Pyrrhus, pear tree. We also have parens, meaning ancestor, and also ferax, meaning fruitful. From there in English we have pear, the fruit of course, but also parent, as your ancestors bore fruit, which is you. When you go back to Genesis, Adam and Eve are commanded not to eat or touch the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and later that Eve saw it was good to eat. We see that fruit frequently was used allegorically to describe begetting children. 96. Reverse cultural appropriation. How all Bible characters differ. The phenomenon we are going to describe here as reverse cultural appropriation is evidently at least 600 years old in Europe, and it is something which is indicative of the role of the merchants in the decay and decline of our society. Once this is evident, it also becomes manifest why in the Bible the term Mystery Babylon is used to describe the system of worldly whoredom operated by those same merchants. So cultural appropriation takes place when members of a particular race or culture adopt cultural elements of another race or culture. With millions all around the world coming to our countries over the past few decades, they have certainly adopted many of our customs. An easy example would be participating in ballet or a classical orchestra, for example, something only Europeans do and which was completely alien to them previously. But here we are using the term reverse cultural appropriation because throughout the Middle Ages, gradually biblical artwork such as the three wise men who visited Christ began to change. Originally they were all European looking, but gradually over the centuries it has changed. By adding other people into the pictures, they are artificially injecting non-Europeans into our historical settings and therefore giving them a share in Europeans' cultural development, and this is why we use the term. The truth is that they do not deserve any credit for any role in the development of Christianity or European culture. So first we shall start off with a quote which clearly sets the stage for deception which we're about to describe. So in December, a 2020 article at time.com titled "Here's What History Can Tell Us About the Magi," and we read the following: medieval art played a key role in how many current Christmas traditions visualize these men. The Magi are a multiracial set of three figurines made sometime before 1489, reflects the increased trade between Europe and Africa during the medieval period, more than anything that was happening when the Gospel of Matthew was written. According to the art historians at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, paintings by artists like Botticelli, Peter Rule Rubens, and Hieronymus Bosch helped cement the image of the Magi as a diverse group of men in popular imagination. So prior to this medieval period, the Magi were not depicted that way. So one of the earliest pieces of art depicting the Magi of the Gospel account is from a mosaic discovered in a restored Byzantium church which dates to about 565 AD, the Basilica of Saint Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna, Italy. This is the period immediately after the time when Justinian had conquered the Goths and Vandals in Italy, parts of Iberia and North Africa, and returned the subjected provinces to Byzantine Roman rule. So this mosaic pictures the three Magi as white men dressed in trousers and enclosed shoes, a long shirt sort of like a tunic, and a cape. The clothing is very colourful and variously patterned. Each of the Magi is wearing a sort of pointed cap called a Phrygian cap by the early Greek writers. The names of each of the three Magi, as they were assigned in later church mythology, are described at the top of the mosaic, and this is the most historically accurate portrayal of the Magi. In classical Greek art, Phrygians as well as Medes, Scythians, Thracians, and men of our eastern and northern nations are depicted as always wearing the so-called Phrygian cap. Phrygian caps began to appear on Greek sculptures of ancient Phrygians in the 4th century BC. By then, as a distinct nation, Phrygia was gone, but by then many Scythians dwelt in Phrygia, and the cap fit the descriptions depictions given by Herodotus and others of the caps of the Scythians. Greek representations of Thracians also had such caps, but Scythians also dwelt there in large numbers. However, the colourful garments of the Magi in the mosaic clearly seem to identify them as Medes, but realistically they were Israelites, as we read in the Bible, who were deported to those cities of the Medes. In Xenophon's Cryopedia, which means the education of Cyrus, we learn that the Persians got their mode of dress from the Medes, where they began wearing colourful robes. So the Byzantines of the 6th century accurately portrayed the Magi as white men and dressed them in the clothing which the true Magi, the priestly tribe of the Parthian Empire, at the time of Christ had most likely worn according to the customs of the Persians and the Medes. But in later medieval depictions, the Phrygian caps were replaced with royal crowns, and their dress became more European, or more often more like how such Europeans had typically imagined 1st century Judeans and others from the east to have dressed. However, also in that same mosaic, the Magi are depicted as approaching a throne-like seat surrounded by 4 white angels and a white Virgin Mary with the white Christ child seated on her lap. So in all of the earliest Christian art from any of the nations of the larger society, Christ, the apostles, the Magi, and even the angels, and all of the other related figures are always depicted as being white. But as we hope to show here, it is the tendency of certain men to want to include other peoples in our culture and society, so the art changes, and usually for the sake of commerce. 97. Discoveries of ancient art and early depictions of Christ. There have been many discoveries, especially with only the last century, of ancient Judean and Christian art, dating generally from the 2nd or 3rd to the 5th centuries AD. In these artistic depictions, not only were Christ and the apostles always depicted as having been white and European looking, but that is also how the Judeans had depicted themselves. So simply put, if early Judeans portrayed themselves and their forebears as having been white, then white they must have been, and this would include all Israelites of course. And here we shall just show a few examples. One such synagogue, which is said to have incorporated Hellenistic images with biblical stories, gives us a picture of how Judeans looked. Among the many mosaics discovered in that synagogue are depicted the trial of Jonah when he was tossed into the sea. Additionally, a near blonde Judean man in an image of the astrological sign for Capricorn, and also a red-haired Judean man next to a Hebrew inscription. Most noteworthy though is a depiction of a Hebrew high priest with a group of younger men facing a Greek general and a troop of soldiers. The image has been interpreted in various ways. Among them, it may represent Alexander's coming to Jerusalem, or an event from the later Seleucid period. The high priest is depicted as white-skinned and having a white-grey beard and hair, and his fellows as white-skinned, fair, and with blondish hair. There is no doubt that these Judeans saw themselves as having the same general racial characteristics as both Greeks and Romans. Then, in the ancient port city of Gaza, a synagogue which was evidently built in 508 AD was discovered in 1965, and on the floor of the synagogue was a mosaic containing a portrait of King David playing a harp, which has since been transferred to a museum. David is depicted with blonde hair and fair skin, wearing a crown with his name written above his head in Hebrew letters. So even as late as 500 AD, the Judeans still depicted themselves as white, and this was before the Arab conquest, when everything changed. Now turn into the earliest Christian portraits of Christ and the apostles, which are found in the catacombs of Thecla and Domitala in Rome, 2 early underground Christian cemeteries. Finding Christian art earlier than the 4th century AD is problematic. Even the Judeans who had made mosaics in their synagogues were breaking with the law in making of graven images, and the early Christians seem to have followed that same law. However, from the 4th century, Christian catacombs did contain mosaics and paintings, as did later Christian churches. So, as far as churches go, the Basilica of St. Pudenzina in Rome contains an apse mosaic which was commissioned in 405 AD and completed as late as 415. It features Christ on his throne in a depiction that contains images from Revelation chapter 4, with a number of his apostles on each side. But some of the catacomb paintings are esteemed to be even older, such as the depiction of Christ between Peter and Paul, dated to the 4th century and found in the catacombs of Marcellinus and Peter. In the catacombs of Thecla, there is a ceiling painting which contains images of Paul, John, Peter and Andrew, esteemed to be about 380 AD. In another image of Peter painted on a nearby wall, his appearance is alike to that of the ceiling painting. In the catacombs of St. Domitala in Rome, there is another painting of Christ seated on a throne surrounded by his apostles, and yet another of Christ teaching among his apostles, And in all of these images, all of the men and women depicted, Christ and his apostles and disciples, are all white without exception. And in the same catacomb is a painting of a reddish-haired, fair-skinned Jonah being spit out of the whale. Now we should note that there is Roman art from as early as the 1st century in Pompeii, which depicts other people. So the Romans were certainly aware of other peoples being out there, but neither Christ nor his apostles were ever depicted as not of being white. So some commentators on these images like to use only certain ones where the figures portrayed seem to be a little bit darker, such as the image of Moses and Aaron at the Red Sea. However, you do notice that they have blondish hair. But when you put all the surviving images together as a whole, the dishonesty becomes manifest. Now finally, let's go back even further, 800 to 1000 years, to discuss some of the art of Iberia that had belonged to the Phoenicians. The sculpture known as La Dama de Bassa features a matronly woman without expression staring straight ahead, settled in a sort of winged chair that appears as if it could be a small throne, and it was found in a cemetery in a high tableland in Granada, Spain. It is a funerary statue over 4 feet tall and almost as wide, and has a compartment believed to have at one time held the ashes of the deceased. A similar sculpture is only a bust, known as the Lady of Elka, and a compartment in his back also leads to the conclusion that it was a funerary urn. The bust is only about 22 inches all, but both of these sculptures are assumed to be about 400 BC. And then one more, the Bica de Balazota, or Beast of Balazota, is a man-bull chimera, which is very much like an Assyrian cherub except for the wings, and a Hebrew cherub except for the wings and the forepart of a lion. It certainly seems to be an adaptation from the cherubs of the East, carved from 2 limestone blocks. The sculpture is 3 foot long and nearly 2.5 feet high. A similar figure appeared on the coins minted in Sicily in the 5th century BC. So in all these sculptures, and even in an early Roman bust of the Phoenician general Hannibal Barca, the Phoenicians are clearly white. In fact, the bust of Hannibal looks very much like the Judean high priest in the painting from the synagogue discovered at Hakkok. But to further understand the appearance of the Phoenicians, we need look no further than the modern Britons, who are descended from them. The Phoenicians were said by Herodotus and others to have had a tin trade in the east with tin from the so-called Cassiterides, or Tin Islands. Without a doubt, these may be identified with Cornwall and the other islands of the coast of Wales. 98. Ancient tombs, cairns and dolmens all across Europe. There are many megalith stone structures all across Europe, but most particularly upon the Phoenician routes of Western Europe, such as the coasts of Spain, France, Scandinavia and the British Isles. The Phoenician Golden Age was anywhere from after Joshua's conquest to the Assyrian deportations, so say the 14th century to around the 7th century BC, and throughout the biblical narrative there are numerous verses indicating megaliths were a custom of the Israelites and even encouraged by Yahweh, and this adds yet more evidence that Europe was colonized from the Middle East, rather than the modern mainstream narrative that Europeans have lived here for tens of thousands of years in the ice as cavemen. We originated as the Israelites and became the Europeans. In Jeremiah there is a prophecy that the deported Israelites would go on to leave a trail of waymarks wherever they went. So in Jeremiah 31, set thee up waymarks, make thee high heaps, set thine heart towards the highway. That's where they're gonna go after the deportations. Even the way which thou wentest, turn again, O Virgin of Israel, turn again to these thy cities. All of these stone structures show us the paths they went. Mainstream academia used to acknowledge that Europe was colonized from the east. Here is a quote on how in the past, educated men believed the stone structures were formed. Europe's prehistoric stone structures have long been the subject of legend, attributed to everything from giants to aliens to Satan. Early modern scientific theories from the 17th and 18th centuries also held that the megaliths originated with a specific group of people. Now they won't say who. These ancients, thought to be from the Near East, the Mediterranean or elsewhere depending on the theory, were believed to have spread their monument building practices over sea routes around ancient Europe. So in other words, the Phoenicians built them. However, now continuing, we see that modern so-called educated men think differently, but such theories began to change with the proliferation of radiocarbon dating in the 1970s. Based on the data dates assigned to scattered megalith sites across the continent, scientists began to create a new map of their origins. Rather than a single group of people spreading the practice, it seemed that different people in different regions must have independently taken to expressing themselves with stone structures around the same time. Portugal, Andalusia, Brittany, England, Denmark and Ireland were all suggested as locals where the practice developed independently based on the timing of the site's construction. Now, carbon dating has been proven to be completely unreliable, and this is more propaganda to hide the truth that the Europeans are the Israelites. However, we must state that these megalith structures are also all over the world, such as in Asia, especially Korea. Evidently, the Israelites spread far and wide, especially after the Assyrian deportations. The Scythians also went to the east, no doubt reaching to India and perhaps as far as China. There are, for example, a recorded 30,000 megaliths in Korea alone, and this only proves that there must have been great European populations in those parts at one time who were capable of building such structures, but they mixed themselves out of existence. Ultimately, Christianity never prevailed in those regions, or at least never became the dominant religion. As a result, there was no barrier between mixing. In Europe, Christians would not marry non-Christians, so there was a form of protection, and Europeans stayed Europeans for 2,000 years. All these former nations in the East had no such barrier, so they fizzled and sank into oblivion. This is why you only find amazing structures that are ancient in the East, whilst in Europe we kept going, kept advancing, building stone structures such as cathedrals that are mind-blowing in beauty and design. Of course, in the past century or so, the West has shared all of its technology and even went out to industrialize and send engineers to build up the East. But if we had never done that and remained separate, would they have the cities they have today? Regardless, the stone structures help us identify where the Israelites went, particularly to Europe, but also teach us a valuable lesson that is evident all throughout the Bible. If you mix, eventually the civilization will collapse and be doomed. This is why the serpent, or race of Cain, are deliberately casting out a flood to overwhelm the woman, us the Europeans, to do just that. 99. Exposing false propaganda against Europeans being Israel. So now we're almost at the end, and after 98 proofs, if you still don't believe the Israelites were white, well, 2 more proofs aren't going to make much of a difference. But if you do believe, you still might be wavering, primarily because of the lies and deception constantly bombarding us, which make you doubt the truth. So instead, for this proof, we shall expose at least some of the propaganda which the Antichrist used in an attempt to try to counter the truth coming out that we are the people of the Bible. But before that, let's start with a few quips and jokes you should seriously consider. When Joshua and the Israelites had invaded the land of Canaan, did they do so with pencils and briefcases to set up banks, or did they invade with swords and axes? Is the Old Testament a banking manual and how to suck all the wealth out of a nation, or is it the moral foundations of laws and principles on how to build a great civilization from scratch? When Christ walked the earth, did he do stand-up comedy, set up a scam, or some fake charity organization? Or did he preach morality and loving your own people? The point is, if the Old Testament was about any other people but the Europeans, it would be a completely different book. It is more likely there would be no Bible at all, and we would all be lost in the Stone Age of Babylonian paganism. Only Europeans followed Christ, heard their shepherd, and through that became the greatest civilization in the world. So now we shall look at some of the crafty arguments our adversaries imagine to use as counter-propaganda, and this is done to ridicule the idea that the Europeans are the people of the Bible, as we said. All of these arguments fall apart quickly if one is well studied and has some common sense. Unfortunately, most of our people are so engulfed in today's pop culture and know very little about history and the Bible, so they easily succumb to these deceptions. Here we shall go through some of the common ones. Firstly, the story of Jacob and Esau. One deception is to try and make out that Jacob's character doesn't fit the moral values and character of the Europeans because he deceived his father Isaac into giving him the birthright in the place of his brother Esau. That instead Esau, Isaac's other son, who was a great hunter and whom Isaac loved, but was cheated out of his birthright, fits much more the European character. Now this is a sneaky switcheroo to try and make us Europeans out to be the bad guys of the Bible, as Edomites became the primary opponents to the Israelite protagonists throughout the Old Testament Testament. So this argument is trying to make you hate Jacob and especially the Bible and see them both opposed to us European people. But if you actually read the Bible for yourself, we see that Jacob's actions were righteous. His mother Rebekah received the prophecy from Yahweh that Jacob would rule over Esau. It was her who insisted Jacob pretend to be Esau to take the blessing. This was after Rebekah overheard Isaac claim he was going to bless Esau as the firstborn son. And since Esau, who as Paul described, was a profane man and a fornicator because of his Canaanite wives, inevitably this meant the blessing would be passed down to Canaanite offspring, who were, as the Bible described, a grief of mind to both Isaac and Rebekah. Rebekah realized the blessing had to pass to Jacob, and Jacob must marry a wife of his own race and people. This way the blessing would stay with our own people. So Rebekah was heroic here. Isaac initially seems to have overlooked this, but as for Rebekah, she explained that if Jacob also married a Canaanite, then her life would have been for nothing, as all of her grandchildren would be Canaanites. Therefore it was imperative that the blessing went to Jacob, who was not a fornicator, rather than Esau. Jacob did not want to go through with it, but Rebekah insisted he did, and that she would take the blame. It is due to her persistence that Isaac finally realizes that Jacob must marry a woman of his own race, explaining to Jacob that if he takes a wife from Laban, then he will inherit the blessing. Therefore Jacob did nothing wrong. Thanks to Rebekah's actions, we exist today. Anyone who understands what's going on in today's world with our nations being overrun, which the prophets identify as Esau's descendants being behind the flood to wipe out Jacob's descendants, should identify themselves with Jacob and not Esau, for it was Jacob who followed his parents' advice and married a woman of his own people. Furthermore, you should hate Esau for his actions of taking the Canaanite wives through his bloodline down to the toilet, corrupting his genetics forever. Speaking of genetics, this brings us to another deception. Some make the assertion that the migrations of the 12 tribes into Europe becoming the European people is impossible. They state that modern DNA and genetic studies absolutely prove that we did not come from the Middle East and can't be the people of the Bible, and this is where supposedly remains of Europeans have been dug up which date back from tens of thousands of years ago and allegedly are genetically identical to modern Europeans. And I might also throw in that these bodies dug up lived in a time far before the Bible was ever written, and therefore have a jab at the Bible being some kind of forgery. First of all, modern academia such as history and science, as well as all major corporations, have long been in the hands of the race of Cain. Therefore, can we really believe any new discovery that comes out, especially in the past decade or two? If they lie about everything, and I mean everything, then why would they tell the truth on our European history and ancestry? Nevertheless, let's look at one study, as it can be interpreted multiple ways, one which aligns with the biblical narrative. In an article posted by the American Association for the Advancement of Science under the title DNA Evidence Uncovers Major Upheaval in Europe Near End of the Last Ice Age, states that DNA evidence lifted from the ancient bones and teeth of people who lived in Europe from the late Pleistocene to the early Holocene, spanning almost 30,000 years of European prehistory, has offered some surprises. And then a little later, perhaps most notably, the evidence shows a major shift in the population 14,500 years ago during a period of severe climatic instability. So they are stating that Europe demographics drastically changed. What could have caused this? Perhaps Yahweh God creating the Adamic race, which he tasked with subduing the world, which already had pre-Adamites roaming around descended from the fallen angels. Normally, as soon as Bible readers hear of science mention discoveries of tens of thousands of years ago, they begin to doubt the Bible, as many falsely believe a timeline longer than 4,500 years, that's the false Masoretic timeline, or even 7,500 years, the correct Septuagint timeline, does not work with the biblical scriptures. You must realize the Bible only states that Adam was created roughly 7,500 years ago, not that the world world is that old, therefore new discoveries does not change anything, and certainly should not shake one's faith in the Bible. Now the article concludes with, the new data shows that the mitochondrial DNA of 3 individuals who lived in the present day Belgium and France before the coldest period in the last ice age, the last glacial maximum, belonged to halogroup M, and this is remarkable because the M halogroup is effectively absent in modern Europeans, but it is extremely common in modern Asian, Australasian and Native American populations. So if we actually believe this study and it was true, then it only proves that there were pre-Adamites roaming around in Europe before the modern Europeans came and displaced them. This perfectly fits with the biblical narrative. Noah lands somewhere in the Middle East, and gradually his descendants spread out, some reaching into Europe, such as the Thracians and Ionian Greeks from Javan. Additionally, the descendants of Noah begin to gradually encounter the remnants of the Nephilim who survived the flood, as the flood was local. Sadly, over time they begin to intermix. Therefore, Yahweh creates the Israelites who spread out into Europe, becoming the Europeans, whilst the rest of the Adamic race mixes itself out of existence. So you end up with the Europeans looking like Europeans, and everywhere else not so much. Therefore, the dug up DNA studies of different demographics in Europe prior to our arrival does not contest the migrations of the 12 tribes to Europe, neither does it disprove the Bible. So now, what about Christianity itself? Some attack the 12 tribes to Europe in a different fashion. They try to claim that Christianity was a Trojan horse, like a backdoor virus so to speak, to weaken Europe and make it ripe and ready for takeover. For this, they even have an ace up their sleeve, as they will claim that Christianity brought down the Roman Empire. Without a knowledge of history, you can see how people can fall for it. They will simply state that Rome was strong and invincible up until about, say, 300 AD, and then it went Christian and collapsed only 150 years later. Therefore, Christianity is what destroyed the Roman Empire. The dates here are accurate, but there are other reasons which brought Rome down, which we will get into. Then, building upon this narrative, they will use Rome as an example and try to apply it to all later European nations. So they will compare, say, the Viking era, painting a picture of strong masculine pagan Vikings whose nations were immune to corruption from banks and usury, contrasting those strong powerful men to the modern effeminate men and laying all the blame at the feet of Christianity, with a conclusion: if Europe didn't go Christian, we'd still be strong and powerful. There's a lot of trickery here, and you see how cunning the adversary is, so we shall break it down. What really crippled and brought down Rome is explained in Daniel, that the iron and clay would mix, speaking of Adamites and non-Adamites, and this would cause the collapse of the Roman Empire. All empires, every one, end up becoming multicultural and bringing people from everywhere. Rome naturally followed this model and only escalated over time. By the year 212 AD, for the first time ever, the Roman Emperor Caracalla made an edict where all free men across the Roman Empire became full citizens. This had a profound effect on the demographics, as previously Romans had very strict marriage laws. They couldn't just marry anyone, especially non-citizens, which at least provided a barrier on Romans mixing. At least it was supposed to. This new law resulted in the demographics change accelerating rapidly, especially in Rome and Italy. Just look at our nations today and how rapidly they've changed in the past 50 years alone. Furthermore, we should add that Rome became decadent. Divorce became the norm. The birth numbers of the native Romans and Italians dropped substantially, essentially what is happening today in our European nations. Due to this, even with Constantine the Great making Christianity the primary religion of the Roman Empire, it could not stop the inevitable collapse that was coming. If Christianity never blossomed anywhere outside Europe and has never done anything to raise up civilizations for non-Europeans, then neither could it revive the decaying Roman Empire. As for the European pagans such as the Vikings, in every single case, Christianity drastically improved their civilization. Some of the greatest Scandinavian kings, such as Knut the Great, who ruled the entire Northern Sea Empire, was a devout Christian. The same could be said for all European nations, such as Charlemagne, who ruled an enormous portion of Europe, overcoming all the pagan nations. There are no examples of Christianity weakening any European nations. Christianity always elevated us, but it did nothing for anyone else, as Christ's sheep heard his voice and became his people. Only we are Christ's sheep. But there is one more angle the Antichrist sometimes will use to attack attack Christianity. They will claim that Christianity is not a native religion to the Europeans. It is some far distant Middle Eastern sand religion that is not compatible with our people, that it was forced upon us, and the pagan religions such as say Odin and Thor are our true religion, that now we have an opportunity to break away from the false Christian religion and embrace our true pagan roots, once again becoming a mighty people, once more to stop our nations being overrun, additionally to break away from all this degeneracy around us to return to the traditional pagan family. If one is to actually read a history book, and if we believe the classics and the historians, many whom were pagans, Roman Greek historians, and even the much later Germanic historians, they all consistently state that the Germanic tribes came into Europe from the east. Furthermore, they date this beginning to around 500 to 600 BC. Therefore, by the time of Christ, these European tribes had only just begun to settle recently. Paganism in Northern Europe would not be very old at all, and if you take it a step further, linking these migrating tribes to the Israelites who were deported by the Assyrians, you understand they were just Israelites who had become nomads. And as we've explained before, it is no surprise that many of the Germanic pagan myths are clearly based on the Bible, such as Ragnarok, Loki, the Great Serpent, the Giants, the World Tree, etc. etc. 100. Christianity explained for noobs. To finish the 100 proofs, we should at least give a brief explanation of Christianity. Most of our people have never had Christianity properly explained to them. Instead, they get the church nonsense, which either turns people away from Christianity or traps them in false beliefs and doctrines. So here is my attempt at least to put it all into perspective, and I pray our people who have watched this video will seriously consider it. To properly explain Christianity, we must start with the context of the Bible right from the beginning, but here we're going to condense it down so it's going to be brief and fast. What you will notice is that there is a clear logical story throughout. The Bible is consistent, and yes, as Yahweh says, he does not change, and even incarnated as Christ, he did not change anything either. Christianity was a reconciliation of Yahweh with his people, as Paul, the apostles, Mary, and Zechariah frequently praise Christ and his reconciliation as promises fulfilled to the fathers, as we've shown previously, such as in Luke chapter 1, he hath helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, as he spoke to our fathers, to Abraham, and to his seed forever. There are many examples of this in the Old Testament, such as in Micah chapter 7, that Yahweh would remember his oath to the patriarchs and come for Israel as Christ. And in Romans chapter 15, Paul reiterates this as well, that Christ came for the promises to the fathers. And then later in Acts chapter 26, that Paul's entire ministry was for the 12 tribes and Paul only went to Europe. Therefore, in other words, Christianity is only for the Israelites to reconcile them and not for anyone else, who are the Europeans, and we were reconciled under Christianity. So at the beginning, before Genesis, from reading all of the Bible, we realized that before Adam was created, we learned that Yahweh created the angels, which is not mentioned in Genesis. And this is why when Adam is created, there is already a tree of knowledge and good and evil in the garden, as well as the serpent, which we learn in Revelation is simply the fallen angels. Out of these angels, some rebelled by mixing Yahweh's creation. And as Christ explained in his parable in Matthew 13, the field is the world, the good seed are the children of the kingdom, i.e. the Israelites, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the devil, and the devil is just the fallen angels, not some spiritual evil entity. The harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels. As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be at the end of this world. These are the words which Christ gave to explain a parable, so he did not answer a parable with another parable. So there really are descendants of the devil or fallen angels in existence. You cannot just shrug this off as most Christians do. Christ also explained in John chapter 15 that he is the vine and his followers were the branches. In other words, Christ is the tree of life, and his Adamic creation, his family, his children, are the branches that grew from it, from Adam and Eve. Furthermore, he explained that upon his return, everyone will be divided into two camps, not three, not four, just two, sheep and goats. The sheep are offered repentance and are taken up to heaven, all of them, but the goats are never offered repentance, and all without exception go to the lake of fire. From all of this, we realize your origin determines your destiny. In the book of Enoch, particularly the Dead Sea Scrolls version, we get a further explanation of this. We learn that the fallen fallen angels mixed their seed with animals, creating monsters and evidently even bipeds. Today we may call this crossbreeding or creating hybrids, but the Bible describes them all as monsters, devils, abominations, and Nephilim, meaning fallen ones, some of which were gigantic in size. Again, these corrupt offspring were already roaming the world when Adam was created. Collectively, they are the tree of knowledge of good and evil, with the fallen angels or serpent being the head. Interestingly, we see in animal hybrids today the propensity for giganticism, such as if you mix, for example, a tiger and a lion producing a liger can grow up to twice the size of a tiger. Thus, how some Nephilim grew to gigantic size can easily be explained by blending the species. If a Nephilim grew to twice the size of a man, so say around 12 foot tall, he would be enormous and terrifying. On a side note, this is an example of a topic your local churches will never go into. They will instead insist we all descend from Adam. Alternatively, your schools and education will push evolution and ridicule the Bible. Now think about this. If this were true, then all throughout the Bible, the prohibitions against mixing and the importance of unmixed blood would not be emphasized, such as Noah being saved because his family had not mixed, or Esau wouldn't have been punished as his mixed wives were just as pagan as Jacob's pure wives. Jacob took pagan wives as well, but they were from his own genetic family, and that was fine. So you can only come to these truths by studying the Bible for yourself. Verily I say unto you, except you be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. He means you need to forego all previous doctrines and start again, like a child with a blank mind, and read the Bible from scratch, meaning you believe what it tells you and not how most Bible teachers will twist the meanings to create a different version of the Bible. Or another way of putting it, as Christ said, "And no man putteth new wine into old bottles, else the new wine will burst the bottles and be spilled, and the bottles shall perish. But new wine must be put into new bottles, and both are preserved. No man also having drunk old wine straightway desireth new, for he saith, the old is better." The old wine is the old beliefs and false doctrines that you've been taught, whilst the new wine is true Christianity that you can only establish by properly examining the Bible for yourself. You cannot therefore mix former false doctrines, old wine, and merge them in with true Christianity, new wine. As Christ warns, the old is better. People will prefer to stick with what they are used to and comfortable with. You have to make that bold step and toss out all the old false doctrines away. Most people just can't do this. They can't get rid of the old doctrines they've been brainwashed in. But you shouldn't want to be comfortable in lives. You must pick up the truth and conform yourself to God. Christians are obligated to carry their cross and have no love for the society, as Paul explained in 2 Timothy, "For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears." In other words, people will listen to what they want to listen, what they like hearing, and not necessarily the truth. So now back to Genesis. After the fallen angels' rebellion, Yahweh God created Adam, which in Genesis 1-8 is commanded to multiply, fill the earth, subdue, and dominate. The word translated as subdue, Strong's 3533 Kabash, could also be translated as trample down or tread underfoot. Yahweh did not want Adam to be friends with the Nephilim, and this is why we read in Genesis 3, Adam is strictly commanded not to touch or eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In other words, not to have any interaction, and especially not to have sexual intercourse, mixing with the Nephilim. The punishment for doing this was death. Ultimately, Adam fails his commission as the serpent snuck in and seduced Eve, and then Adam accepted Eve back and even raised Cain as his own son. In John 8, Christ accused certain men in Judea as being, "You are of your father the devil, and the lust of your father you will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh as his own, for he is a liar and the father of it." Only Cain was the first murderer, who evidently is of the devil, a fallen angel. The men Christ accused were therefore devils as well, as Cain begets Cain. That last part, "for he is a liar and the father of it," could be more accurately translated as, "because he is a liar and his father." Cain was a liar, and so was the fallen angel who lied to Eve and seduced her. You must realize either Christ is saying they descend from Cain, or he is slandering. So was Christ a slanderer, or was he speaking the truth? Only God can know someone's ancestry back thousands of years, something we can't do, but Christ could do it on sight. Christ also also said that if they were the seed of Abraham, they would act how Abraham did, because behavior is inherited through genetics. Either you're an Adamite or you're a non-Adamite, and the law is written on the hearts of the Israelites. A tree is known by its fruits. Those Pharisees descended from Cain through Esau's intermarriage with the Hittites, who were Canaanites, would mean the fallen angel, the serpent in the Garden of Eden, was their true patriarch instead of Adam. So back to Genesis, in 3:15, Yahweh explains that he will put enmity between the two races. The fallen angel's offspring, aka the Nephilim, which would include Cain, will have enmity with the seed of the woman, which is the Adamic race. Eve's seed is also Adam's seed. Whilst Cain is technically Eve's son, genetically he is not the same as Eve, as Cain is a hybrid, so he's the seed of the serpent, as all serpent seeds are hybrids or Nephilim. The enmity between the races is forever. In Revelation 12, we see the serpent is persecuting the woman. The woman is Yahweh's wife, the Israelites, but at this point they had been divorced, which we will get to, and therefore they are collectively referred to as the woman instead of the wife. We see that the woman, or Israelites, give birth to Christ. The reason the sun and the moon are at her feet is because it's an allegory for the government and rulership of the world. The Israelites were destined to rule the world, and the 12 stars above her head make it clear it's the 12 tribes of Israel and nobody else. And next, the serpent or dragon is described as having 7 heads, because there were 7 great empires that had come, which the bankers or race of Cain were the true power behind. The dragon also drew away 1/3 of the stars, and this is the fallen angels that fell before Adam. So this is an amazing prophecy that is relating the fall of the fallen angels and connects them to the race of Cain and Nephilim, who are still trying to destroy us and are behind all the world empires. They also tried to kill Christ here. This of course was Herod, and Herod was an Edomite. Then the woman flees into the wilderness. This is the Israelites moving to Europe, where they are promised some time of rest under Christianity. Next, again a prophecy that connects the fallen angels being cast out of heaven, but also the race of Cain being cast out of Europe, because Christianity excluded them. The prophecy is connecting the two. Then we see another connection between the devil, the angels, the serpent, that they are all one and the same. So you must realize this when you read Genesis. The next verse clarifies everything we've just said, that the Christians overcame the race of Cain. Christianity was heavily persecuted initially in the first few centuries, and it was primarily the race of Cain behind this. But Christianity prevailed, or as it says, the blood of the Lamb and his testimony, which is the gospel. Now the fallen angels were not cast out of heaven by the gospel, so it must be Christianity in Europe, but also linking this to a similar victory to when the fallen angels were cast out. And again we realize the race of Cain have taken over the role of the serpent in trying to destroy the Adamic creation or mix it out of existence. Now in regards to the race of Cain being kicked out of Europe, how did they retaliate? The serpent cast out a flood to try and wipe out the remnant of the seed of the woman. Initially this was the Islamic conquest. When it failed, and especially when Europeans began colonizing the whole world, a new strategy was needed. Today it's called mass immigration. Christ's revelation helps us identify who is who. Here finally explains that they will continue to try and wipe out the Christian people, who in the earlier verse are described as the remnant of the woman. Well, what people and which nations are being flooded? Those must both be the Israelites and what's left of the Adamic race. So now back to Genesis. In Genesis 6 we learned that the Adamites didn't learn the lesson from Adam's fall and began mixing again. This results in Yahweh commanding Noah to build an ark. The flood destroys all of Adam kind except Noah and his family, but as we've explained, the Hebrew word eretz just means land, but it's translated here as earth or world numerous times, which creates a false perception that the whole world was flooded. One verse which helps support that the whole world was not flooded is verse 12, where it is explained that all the animals died and every man, and the word for man there is Adam, wherever the breath of life was. Now Yahweh only breathed a living spirit into Adam, so the flood is only where Adam kind or the breath of life was at this time. Any Nephilim outside of those regions survived, and it is for this reason after the flood, as explained later in Genesis, we still have Nephilim, giants, and the Kenites or race of Cain that survived the flood. Where else could they have come from? Noah was pure, so logically these evil races must have survived the flood, and yes, they are still around us today. But also here there was only one law given at this point, not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. evil, and this was the law which was punishable by death. Thus the great flood must have been the death penalty for breaking this law. If not, what law were the Adamites breaking? There was no other laws. Since the Adamites were mixing with the fallen angels, it gives us further evidence that the sin of eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil can only be mixing, which was punishable by death, and not eating an apple or something silly like that. You must remember that Yahweh only punishes his children and not bastards, as Paul says in Hebrews, and that is why a day of vengeance is reserved for these aliens. Yahweh chastises his children and reserves vengeance for his enemies, so that he may make known the wealth of his honor upon Israel, as Paul explained in Romans 9. So after the flood through Noah's 3 sons, Adamkind is given a second chance to fulfill Yahweh's original commission for Adamkind, to multiply, trample down the Nephilim races, and subdue the earth. Once again they fail and begin mixing. Furthermore, as a result, they stray away from the one true God into pagan religions of the Nephilim. For this reason, Yahweh calls Abraham out of this pagan world. He chooses one man, just like Noah, to restart civilization. It is crucial to understand this part, as there is a logical build-up to the reason for the call of Abraham. If not, Yahweh would have to once again flood the world and restart, but he promised Noah he would never flood the world again. The key part to the call of Abraham, which most Christians overlook, is that the promises Yahweh made were all unconditional. The burden of keeping the promises, that Abraham's seed would become many nations, as numerous as the stars, that kings would come from his seed, etc. All of this Yahweh had to keep no matter what. Yahweh swore by himself, in effect meaning that if he would ever fail, he would cease to exist. This Paul mentions in Hebrews, and because Yahweh is perfect and can't fail on any of his promises, this covenant is a firm anchor on the souls of any biological descendants of Abraham today. When Yahweh leads Abraham's descendants, the Israelites, out of Egypt, giving them the law at Mount Sinai, this was the new beginning. Just like when Noah's 3 sons restarted civilization after the flood, this was another start. Now Yahweh would solely focus on one family, the Israelites. Adamkind had begun freedom to govern themselves and overcome the Nephilim races, but they failed. The Israelites were given stricter laws to build a civilization amongst the pagan world. As Yahweh had given up on the rest of the Adamic race, they would either be replaced and absorbed into the Israelite nations promised to come, or they would be overrun by the Nephilim. We see this especially with the Arabic conquest of the Middle East. As for the Israelites, Yahweh would chastise them to ensure they kept the laws. If they obeyed, they would be blessed. But if they disobeyed, they would be overrun by the Nephilim races as punishment. But they always had room to repent, and Yahweh would heal their nations once more. Now, moving to Joshua, as the Israelites invaded the land of Canaan, they were commanded to wipe out the Canaanites and give an opportunity to wipe out the Nephilim races once and for all. But once again, our ancestors failed. Once they took possession of the lands and were comfortable, they instead put the surviving Canaanites under tribute. For this utter failure, we still suffer today. We can only imagine that if they did obey Yahweh, the Israelites would keep expanding and keep going and wipe them all out. Although they failed, and Yahweh will not fail, as Christ explained, when he returns, all the goat nations are going into the lake of fire. Yahweh had promised Moses rest for the people if they succeeded in the conquest, but they failed and therefore didn't achieve the conquest. And this is why Paul writes in Hebrews that Joshua failed to give them rest. But Christ, Yahshua, the second Joshua, who shares the same name, will give us rest, and he will not fail to destroy these enemies. Israel was released out of captivity in Egypt and was led into conquest by a man named Joshua or Yahshua. Israel now awaits to be released from captivity in Mystery Babylon, and to be led in conquest by a man named Joshua again, and that is Yahshua Christ. Initially, the Israelites had no ruler over them. Yahweh was their God, but also the de facto king of Israel. As a result, more or less, nobody was tyrannized, and as the Bible describes, everyone did what they thought was right in their own mind. However, this did not stop the Israelites sinning, especially as the surviving Canaanites amongst them corrupted them. In a nutshell, the Bible explains you would get a good generation, then the next generation would begin to sin. This would result in Yahweh chastising them, such as the Canaanites or Philistines rising up against the Israelites for a while. Once the Israelites began to repent and cry to Yahweh, Yahweh would rise up up a judge to deliver them. Then for a while you would get a good generation again, only for the next generation to start sliding back, and the whole cycle to start again. It is important to understand this as it leads on to the next part of the story. To break out of this cycle, our ancestors demanded a king to rule over them, which Yahweh declared was turning away from Yahweh and instead turning to an earthly authority or king. The Israelites imagined by having a king, he would deal with all the surrounding hostile nations. This way the Israelites could live however they wanted and couldn't be chastised, i.e. invaded by the foreign nations. But Yahweh explained the reality of the situation, that having a king rule over them would not be as smooth as they imagined. A king would inevitably become a tyrant, and when the Israelites cried out because of this, he would not answer them. And this is a crucial part of the story, as this is the reason us Europeans have been tyrannized by kings and empires and earthly authorities up to this day for thousands of years. So when people ask, why does God allow bad things to happen? Firstly, he chastises our nations for sin, but also importantly, our ancestors' choice doomed us to earthly authorities. Just like how Adam's choice brought death into the world, the Israelites' choice of a king meant never-ending tyrannies reigning over us. This is all part of our learning for this life. As Solomon puts it, it is an exercise in vanity, and it prepares the people for obedience in the kingdom to come. So eventually the Israelites in the land of Canaan grew so decadent and mixing became prevalent, which inevitably led to Yahweh deporting the Israelites. This was a punishment, but also the only way to save our ancestors. By deporting them, the Israelites were separated from the evil Canaanites and also humbled. Yahweh did not abandon his people and promised them they would overcome the nations to wherever they were scattered, and it did not take long for them to rise up where they had been deported to. They became the mighty Cimmerians, Galatae and Scythians. Eventually they overran Europe and even brung down the Roman Empire and have dominated Europe and then the whole world ever since. The deported Israelites had become pagans as they no longer had a shepherd, Yahweh, leading them, sheep scattered abroad. For this Yahweh promised he would come after them, such as in Hosea, and as we've explained, Yahweh's relationship with his people was like a husband and a wife. The deportations were a divorce, and as the Israelites had whored themselves out with the other alien nations, mixing with them and worshipping their gods, as a result they were a cheating wife, and the law states a husband cannot take back a wife who has committed adultery, as we see in Deuteronomy. So Yahweh came down as a man and died on the cross. This way the wife, the Israelites, were freed from the husband, as technically a cheating wife was under the death penalty. But if the husband died, then there was no accusers and she was free from the penalty. Christ was resurrected and now he could remarry his people, the Israelites. This is all explained in Romans as well as in Acts. Christ's gospel, Christianity, spread to Europe and the Israelites were reunited with their God, Yahweh. The next important part of understanding the Bible is Yahweh's promise was if the Israelites returned to him under Christ, they would once again be elevated on top of the world. They would be blessed with great nations and come to dominate the world as they once had done in the land of Canaan. We Europeans did return to Yahweh and did come to obey his commandments once more. Europe has been the center of civilization ever since. However, the Canaanites followed us into Europe and infiltrated our great nations, and gradually over the centuries corrupting them all over again, and as a result making our nations decadent again and turning us away from Yahweh. Therefore we have voided the promise of being blessed and elevated. We have returned back to the sinful state we were when we were deported by the Assyrians. As a result we are being punished by being overrun by aliens. The only way out of this is to once again turn back to Yahweh. Since most of our people are deceived, this is a very tough message to spread. The few of us who are somewhat awake and fed up with our nations being flooded and the decline of our society as a result don't like the message we are spreading. If you say we must repent, you will no doubt be criticized as doing nothing, just sitting around doing nothing and praying to God is not going to get us anywhere, they will say. Or sitting around waiting for Christ to save us is often a quote to make us look like we're doing nothing. However, this is a complete misunderstanding of the true message. We're in this situation because we have become decadent and a sinful nation turning away from our God. So even if you're out there doing something, Activision, but you're still watching TV, the football, Netflix, playing video games and engulfed in the pop culture the Antichrist have forced upon us, how can you truly want change? All of the above is adultery. It's one of the many reasons we as Europeans are being punished by Yahweh. Our people who are engulfed enjoy the society. What they really want is just to rewind our society by 50 years or so. They want to go back to better times and continue living in sin just as we are now. What they fail to grasped, as living that way will always inevitably lead to a nation declining into the state we're in now. But furthermore, there are key overreaching prophecies that are playing out, and you cannot change them whether you like it or not. We are in the time of Jacob's trouble, which was destined to occur after the end of the 7 times punishment. As we've explained, the deported Israelites were to undergo 7 times punishment of 360 years, which works out to be 2,520 years. The Assyrian deportation started around 720 BC, so if you do the maths, it brings us to around 1800 AD, and this was the beginning of the so-called Age of Liberty, where many revolutions took place and the nobility was ended. Europe no longer was ruled by tyrants and instead turned into democracies. Here we as a people in our nation since then have had the opportunity to govern ourselves. However, we have found ourselves in a far worse situation, as now the Edomites have subverted our nations and rule over us with their international banking system. This is one of the many end-time prophecies that were going to happen. We've mentioned all of them, but a quick recap. Isaac blessed Esau that Jacob's descendants would rule over him, but one day the situation would become reversed. We're in that moment right now. This is also the time of Jacob's trouble, which we just mentioned, because Esau is trying to wipe out our people, Jacob, the Israelites. And this is also Christ's warning that the end times will be like the days of Noah, the Adamites being overwhelmed by Nephilim once again. And this is also Jeremiah's Israel and Judah being mixed with the seed of beast. So who are the beasts? Is he talking about horses and donkeys, or is he talking about people? And this is also Ezekiel's and Revelation's prophecies of the Israelites being overrun and flooded by aliens. All of this had to happen, as when Christ returns, he is saving his people. We see he is saving us primarily from the actions of Esau's descendants, who also killed Christ. Overall, 2 things should stand out. 1, we must realize who we are and remember our Israelite identity. And 2, we must turn back to Yahweh, our shepherd, and repent. We are promised one day this will happen, and that is the purpose of this 100 Proofs video, which I pray is part of Yahweh's plan to play a part in helping our people come to the truth. Praise Yahweh, and thanks for watching. Please do share these videos, and you can download them all at Christogenia.